The captain awakes. Xenos tech. Van Lescus takes her chance. A series of crack grenades detonated at the helm of the Blood King, taking out a large part of the vessel's controls. In response, light pulsed along crooked tracks under the deck, like signals along a nerve, all leading to the brazen statue. The cracks in the metal grew. "Get back," said Arios. The two intercessors on the platform with him backed up, guns trained on the statue. Metal flaked away in glowing chunks. Black fingers flexed. The Space Marines opened fire, riddling the metal with bolt rounds. Explosions peppered the statue. The head started to move, but slowly, as if in pain, and Arios thought the threat might be dealt with easily. But when a melter charge went off by the primary weapons control station, the metal coating on the statue glowed with sudden heat, and the being imprisoned within surged to its feet. Molten metal sprayed across Arios and his two men. The captain of the ship confronted the boarders, revealing itself as a muscular demon 15 feet tall. Rivers of hot brass poured off hideous armor. The skull face was alive with infernal light. One hand was a giant claw, the other ended in a grisly mass of bone, flesh, and metal, shaped in blasphemous parody of an imperial bolt gun. Bolt rounds deflected harmlessly from its front. It lifted its gun fist and screeched. A giant shell shot from the muzzle on a burst of purple fire, hitting one of the two intercessors on the dais in the chest. His armor shattered, and he was carried off the dais by the impact, arms wheeling, to crash down on the floor. There, the infernal bullet detonated, and the Space Marine exploded into 1,000 wet pieces. "Take it down!" Arios commanded. He and his surviving companion leapt from the dais, landing heavily on the main deck. The demon pulled forward. Dozens of input leads uncoiled from its back, seemingly growing directly from its flesh to link it with the ship. They creaked as it pulled against them, heaving to be free. All of the Space Marines on the lower deck were firing now. Bolt rounds crackled off the creature. A plasma stream burned across its shoulder, a hit that would have killed a Space Marine, but the demon merely screamed its outrage and heaved harder. The cables parted with singing notes. Blood spurted from their ruptured ends. Instrument lumens flickered all over the deck, and power died. Ill-maintained klaxons gave out sorrowful honks as the Blood King pitched forward into a slow dive. The ship was coming under heavier fire as Van Lescus's own task force drove through the center of the Chaos Fleet. Blood King was not the largest or most powerful of the enemy vessels, but the discipline it imposed on the ships around it made it a prime target. "Bring it down!" Arios shouted, "or we are all lost!" He called for reinforcement from his beleaguered rearguard, knowing that it would cost them in blood to leave their fight. The demon's fist opened fire, giving a report more akin to a choking spasm than a gunshot, each bolt blasting a Space Marine down with such violence there was little left. Arios wondered how such a thing, encased in metal, without a command crew, could command a ship, let alone a fleet. The galaxy he had woken to was insane. Messinius and his kind had been facing this for millennia. There were no rational answers to what he saw. The only possible response was violence. The Space Marine's guns blazed. Divots of fleshy bronze chipped from the demon's hide, but it did not stop its slow advance, nor did it stop blasting them from their feet, slowly, one at a time, like an agri-worker on pest control. They were nothing to it. Arios could feel its contempt. Guns ran dry. The lost bolt rifle magazines clattered to the floor. Coolant cells for plasma weapons rang empty from the deck. The demon lifted its head, roared, then charged. It was unstoppable, slamming warriors aside with its bulk so hard their armor broke, stamping on those who fell. Its claws sheared through ceramite like it was cloth, and Adeptus Astartes' blood sizzled on the thing's baking skin. Warriors who weighed hundreds of pounds in their armor were smashed aside like straw men. Arios threw down his pistol and drew his sword. The power field activated with a hard crack. The demon turned towards him, the struggling Desnius in its fist. It ignored the jabbing of the Tech Marine's servo arms as if they were the slaps of a child. The command deck shook as Imperial cannons pounded the craft. "Fight me!" Arios called. "Prove yourself to your bloody god by fighting me!" The thing laughed. It held up its gun to Desnius's chest, put a bullet in him, and dropped his broken remains. Then it spoke.
"I destroy your men, and you think yourself a worthy opponent," it growled.
Its voice came from everywhere.
"I, who have earned the praise of Khorne for my service, who have brought to wreckage 1,000,000 ships, I, who was once a mortal man, denied the gift you take for granted. I, who chose my path and reached the end, while all the others died in bloody ruin at my feet. I, who master Khorne's rage and turn it against his foes in holy slaughter.
It halted in front of him. Hot, empty eye sockets stared down. Arios took his sword hilt in both hands.
You are not worthy,
it said. The talon swipe caught Arios by surprise, but he caught the blow on his sword edge, twisting the blade so the force of it spilled off and sent the claws past his head, or he would have lost the weapon. Ancient technology fought with unnatural power. The disruption field blazed, and the tip of a claw clanged to the ground. Arios was ready for the next blow, a pile-driving punch from the gun fist. He pivoted out of the way, dodging both the hit and the bullet meant for him. He swung his blade up in a wide arc, adding the momentum of his turn to the swing, and cut across the demon's upper arm. Burning ichor fountained from the wound, and the demon roared with anger. The blood metal splashed across Arios's eyes, obscuring his view for a crucial moment. He pawed at his eye lenses, clearing them in time to see the talons spearing towards him, but not to avoid it. The tips of the claws ripped through his armor, shattering power conduits and opening the chest plate. His undersuit tore. Blood welled from his chest. Arios fell back onto the ground, where he struggled to rise. The demon licked his blood from its hand.
You are not like the others, it said. You taste different. Something new, but just as pathetic.
Arios got to his knees, bringing up his sword to guard his face, but he was lost. He stared down the repellent barrel of the demon's gun. I am the same as all the others who came before me, the same as all those who fought for the Emperor and died to ensure things like you were ended. I am Ferran Arios, and I do my service gladly.
How poetic, the demon said. Death to the false Emperor!
Explosions ripped all around the monster's face as Fragstorm assault grenades detonated in clouds. Shrapnel scythed everywhere, spanging off Arios's armor and digging into his exposed flesh. The roar of auto-boltstorm gauntlets followed. Hundreds of rounds expended in seconds, carving out a deep crater in the demon's chest. Arios saw the weakness and threw himself forward into the deadly hail of fire. His own warrior's guns ripped at his armor. A bolt wedged itself in his thigh, blowing out a scoop of muscle. Pain almost undid him, but he kept his focus, angling the point of his sword at the demon's wound and thrusting it deep into its chest. Pushed by the impetus of his leap, it scraped through and out the beast's back in a spray of lightning and crackling detonations. The bolt fire stopped. Arios hung from his sword, his wounded leg unable to support him. The demon swayed over him, its limbs locked once more into the form of a statue. Arios pushed himself back from its topple, sprawling onto the ground as it hit the deck with a resounding crash. He looked up. Most of the men who had come onto the bridge with him were dead. The last few were emerging from cover. 3 aggressors stood in the command deck gateway, the underslung guns on their forearms smoking. His armor display sang out warnings of multiple breaches and systems failures. Mercifully, his pharmacopoeia was functioning, and it flooded his body with pain nullifiers. They numbed his senses, but his mind raced. He had never felt so alive. The Blood King continued its slow plunge away from the plane of battle, now being pounded by several Imperial ships. The void was full of wreckage, of furious explosions, blinding flashes, and silent death. "Contact Van Lescus," he said. "I would like to leave this place alive." Messinius' space marines moved towards those priests who were chosen to face the Inceptors, pushing them back towards the device. The flesh-metal meld of machine casings burned with a frightful stench. The Inceptors could get no closer in the air to the spinning Blackstone device and backed off, landing and taking up position at the edges of the plaza. Warriors on foot came up the stairs, intercessors, hellblasters, and lastly, aggressors. Half of them advanced on the center, while the others turned about to keep the armies of demons at their back. Lacrante realized that this advance was not a sign of triumph, but that they stood on the precipice of defeat. The Space Marines were taking refuge around the device. Chilka knelt before Rostov. He hurriedly undid her pack. the whole back of which folded down, revealing inside a block of dull, silvery metal. At first, Lacrante thought it was featureless, but then Rostov and Antoniato pulled it out, and he saw that a single line was cut into it across the middle, and a small cartouche was impressed on the center of one face.
Here! Here!
Rostov was shouting, pointing at the central bank of machines. He and Antoniato dragged the cube over. Lacrante looked past the Inquisitor. Demons surrounded the Space Marines on all sides. Warriors in different colors stood shoulder to shoulder, their bolters pouring out a wall of fire. Plasma weapons and flamers scoured away sections of the advancing horde, but as he watched, he saw warriors cast down their emptied main armaments and take out their pistols, and when they were exhausted, their knives. Demons crashed into their lines. The Space Marines fought bravely, but their numbers were dwindling, while those of the foe never lessened. He turned to the Lord Lieutenant. "How much ammunition do they have?" he asked. Messinius stared at his men.
Not enough.
Lacrante looked back to Rostov, expecting to see them engaged in arcane rituals beyond his comprehension. Instead, the Inquisitor and Antoniato were swinging the metal block between them like common laborers about to toss a heavy load into a cargo 8. Toss it they did, straight at the machinery. He expected it to crash through. Instead, it exploded like water, liquid metal showering all over the Dark Mechanicum devices controlling the Blackstone engine before sinking into them without trace. Overhead, the Blackstone engine continued its thrumming spin. "It didn't work," he gasped. He looked at Messinius. He felt numb. "I won't die a coward," he said, and powered up his hellgun.
Nobody's dying,
shouted Antoniato. He came running from the machines with Rostov.
Get into cover!
Lacrante followed, skidding around the smouldering remains of a machine node. Messinius stayed where he was, staring at the device.
Stay down, said Rostov. Do not run. If you get outside the emanation point and are exposed directly to the blast, it will annihilate your soul. If the engine does not come down on top of us, we have a chance.
What's happening? Said Lacrante. Xenos technology, my friend, said Antoniato. Watch. The light emitted by the Dark Mechanicum machines was changing from an angry red to a cold, steady green. Silver lines spread out over the devices, eating into them like acid. Then he saw the silver was not consuming them, but reworking them, changing them to something else. Tendrils of silver spread across the ground from the machines, like roots at first, then forming regular lines that spread and connected, linking the changing machine node to others, and infecting those too with ruthlessly regular circuit patterns. The Blackstone floor made a sound like cracking glass, and grooves appeared in the surface, spreading also, glowing the same cold green light. As they multiplied, their spread accelerated until they were running swiftly over the ground all over the plaza. The Blackstone engine slowed. It began a pulsing hum, and a heavy feeling washed over Lacrante with each beat. The green lightning ceased. The red fires went out. All of a sudden, the device came apart, the great spears falling away from the hub, crashing down onto the landscape around the plaza, crushing combatants from both sides. The hub remained, wobbling madly on its axis until it too came loose and was flung away like a giant slingstone. The ground was thrumming, and green light ran spider-swift over everything. There was the sound of rock on rock, and he saw the first of the spears thrown clear of the engine rising up on the plain, the green light playing all over it. Another grumbled upright, then another. When 3 were erect, the green lightning returned to link them, but this time it was cleaner, purer, and when it danced down from the pinnacles of each spear tip and lashed through the demonic army, the creatures vanished. He saw then that they were not spears, but great obelisks, chipped, abused, but their shape was clear. Something had made these long ago. Another obelisk rose up, then another, until all 8 were pointing skywards in a circle around the plaza. The obelisks were not perfectly aligned. They wobbled, their bases were ragged, and they were of differing heights. There was no telling how large the structures they were taken from had been, but Lacrante had the feeling he was seeing only a vestige of their power. The asteroid shook. The pulse grew in intensity until the tremors ripped at his guts. The demons screeched, their cries of victory turning to anger, then to fear. The circle of space marines contracted, their numbers now much reduced, but the demons did not follow. Instead, they wavered, then turned and fled.
Lord Lieutenant, get down! Cried Rostov.
Messinius stared at them. The pulsing tremors reached a crescendo, changing in pitch and tempo to a constant, bone-shaking hum. The green lightning became more regular, steadier, growing into a curtain between the obelisks that was so intense it seemed solid. Just as Lacrante thought his skull would burst, the light flew outwards in every direction, and reality was upended. Lacrante had a fleeting impression of demons evaporating and space marines collapsing to the ground. A deadness smothered his heart, and he experienced a lessening of himself. His last sensations were seeing Messinius standing there, watching, and hearing Chilka hiss through gritted teeth.
"Bloody Xenos," she said.
Then blackness so profound it was heavier than any death could ever be pulled at him, and he was gone from the world for a while. Athagay could count the remaining time of her life in seconds. The hellship remained clamped to the side of the St. Aster. The demons were butchering their way through the Space Marines, ripping them to pieces with their claws and swords. Sons of Dawn retaliated with such perfection, Athagay felt privileged to see them fight before she died. But for every demon they slew, 2 more stepped through the breach onto the deck, which steamed and writhed under their touch. She loosened her sidearm in its holster. Her crew were doing the same, abandoning their stations, taking cover, and preparing to sell themselves to the last. The creatures emanated waves of pure rage, but she was proud that none of her company succumbed this time. They waited with their guns ready and prayers to the Emperor on their lips. The last Space Marine fell down, eviscerated. Red bodies were heaped high around the site of their last stand, but the demons were legion, and more were coming through. They hefted their swords and formed into a loose phalanx around their leader, a creature twice the size of its followers, carrying a sword as long as Athagay was tall. It raised one massive claw and clenched it.
"Blood for the blood god,"
it hissed. The Psi Oculus set up an eerie wail. Everyone was staring fear-struck at the Neverborn, but Athagay noticed the alarm even as the demons charged. The energy wave from the Blackstone device hit the battle group. The St. Aster's void shields collapsed. The wave passed through the metal of the vessel and into the crew's flesh, and Athagay felt something vital lift from her body. She had a wrenching sensation that she was duplicated, or perhaps she had always been that way, 2 parts of one whole. Raging light and a scream of dying universes blasted her mind. She held on to herself, feeling her spirit pulled away from the meat of her body. It was painful to her, but to the demons it was annihilation. They screamed abominably as they were wiped to smears of glowing corpuscent. Everyone was screaming. Athagay felt the attention of unwelcome eyes on her from some place beyond the here and now. The demon ship was lifted up on the glowing blast and wrenched from the St. Aster's hull. As it was torn free from its prey, demonic flesh withered and became necrotic, flaking off into space. Teeth detached and floated away before evaporating into nothing. The whole shuddered and died. Confronted by its own impossibility, the demonic ceased to be, leaving clean void and the corroded hulk of a dead Imperial ship tumbling end over end into the night. Then the energy pulse was gone, racing into space, and the ship was adrift, its void shields burned out, toxins wailing at the dangerous reaction of the warp engines to the wave. Athagay found herself on the floor. The data claws she wore on her right hand were broken, and her wrist was sprained. She cradled her arm to her chest and pushed herself back into her command throne. The entire crew was affected, lying still, most unconscious, some groaning, a few, like her, of rare fortitude, shrugging off the effects of the Blackstone emission and shakily returning to their duties. Lights flickered. The ship's systems seemed unaffected by the blast front, so long as they were rooted completely in the material realm. Those that weren't had suffered. A number of servo skulls were dead on the floor, and at the rear of the room where servitors were linked in series to the ship, many lay inert, smoke curling from their cooked brains. The portal was gone, as were the foe, leaving only their bloody handiwork behind to show they had ever been there at all. Athagay was too weak to talk. All she could do was slump in her chair, her feet thrust before her at awkward angles. She tried several times before she remembered how to speak. "Open the oculus," she said. Her tongue was thick in her mouth. Nobody responded. Clumsily, she pawed at a control board set into her throne arm until she had the necessary interface available and keyed the oculus open herself. The shutters swiveled aside and withdrew into the armored mullions of the great window. Although the ship was yawing out of control and taking the Oculus away from the rift, she could see the blast wave's effect on it, and she could scarcely credit what she saw. As the energy blast hit the tear, it rolled up, like coloured cloth tidied away from a black floor. Already it had receded well beyond a safe distance, the gas and energy wreathing the rift dissipating quickly once the gash in the fabric of space was closed. The pulse raced on, accelerating against natural law, as if its consumption of the stuff of the warp energized it. For millions of miles behind them, the rift vanished completely from space until it was a sickly glow far away upon the horizons of infinity. Fionnuala pulled herself up from the deck. Drool streamed from her mouth, and she was shaking. Still, she managed to key open a wide-cast Vox channel. "All ships, report!" Nothing came back. She accessed another channel and tried again. Static hissed over the network. All ships, report," she repeated. A tense pause. Static jumped. A voice came out of it, distant and weak. "Vox Lexica, reports." "Coming light, reports," came another. More people were returning to their stations. Helmsmen worked to right the ship, firing maneuvering jets to halt its slow rotation. "Ars Bellus, reports." More affirmations of life came in from the surviving escorts and the remaining Space Marine craft. More of the crew were recovering. Noise returned to the bridge, mostly cross-checks and damage reports. Alarms were shut off. The groans of the wounded and the weeping of those whose minds had broken took their place. "Psi Oculus, report," croaked Athagay. "Give me scry status on the rift." Hurried enquiries were made of the machines. Lieutenant Gonan delivered their verdict. "Psi Oculus is badly damaged, but indications are that the enemy are gone. The rift has receded beyond the range of immediate return augurs." In the dark, the asteroid floated, its blackstone burden inert upon the surface. The demon ship had passed out of human sight, its speeding corpse a dull orange signum on the tactoliths, rune tags reading "Threat Negligible." Battle light flickered still far away, where Van Lescus took on the main enemy fleet. Whatever happened there, this was undeniably a victory. Fionnuala turned around, half holding herself up on the instruments. Her legs bounced, like they would give out under her at any moment. "Well, Eloise, if she survived, I think we can tell Van Lescus that we won." Athagay shifted in her command throne and leaned forward. Her strength was already returning. "No, Fionnuala, as much as I would like to claim credit, I think we will tell her that Rostov won." The Blood King yawed out of control, plunging down through the battle. Arios's message finally got through, and Van Lescus ordered all fire upon it to cease immediately. She ran her eyes over the main hololith. Battle Group Bataris had taken 20% losses, but had punched through to the other side of the enemy fleet. Battle Group Alphas's split task forces embraced the outside of the formation, harrowing their flanks and bunching them up, while her own group was following in the wake of Bataris, forcing the gap wider, waves of bombers targeting ships already damaged by Bataris's run. "Madam Fleetmaster," an excited voice relayed, "the rift is closed. Battle Group St. Aster has succeeded." A wild cheer went up from the strategium. "Shh, shh," she said. Her eyes were fixed on the far side of the battle. They were going to win. The question was by how much. For her, only total victory would do. "One more piece remains to enter play." Minutes passed, then another report. "Battle Group Delpharis is entering the battlesphere." Van Lescus turned her attention to a Trupic depiction. Visible through scintillating wreckage and flashing explosions, a warp egress was forming some tens of thousands of miles away. Ships speared from the warp on the far side of the enemy. "There we have it," she said, with satisfaction. "Send orders to Group Master Grunfeld to engage at full speed. Put out a general order to the fleet, as follows. Fleet Tertius, all groups attack. Split them, hunt them, finish this." The Slaughter Crusade was trapped between the two Imperial forces, divided down the middle, and the isolated groups enveloped. Its annihilation was to take only 4 hours. Chapter 39. Scribum Errant. 1/8923-FG-4. Journey's End. Nora Nissen, Nora said, holding up the missive she had carried for so long. Scribum Processus, Departamento Processium Quintus, Missive Sorting Division, Scribum Errant Claim Ratified. I perform his will. The words had become reflexive since she first said them. The day after the Stink River, she had said them so many times. Hive Bottom, the man in the booth said, disinterestedly. He looked up at her. Which adept are you here to petition? There was only a single small oval opening in the yellowed plastic surrounding him, and his voice had a muffled submarine quality. He spoke loudly to overcome it. 1/8923-FG-4, she said. She had memorized the number. Every night she had gone to sleep with it, whirling around her head, chasing her into uneasy dreams. The man at the desk marked down her name and her destination in a thick ledger. He tossed a metal token into the security drawer at the front of his desk and shoved it out with unnecessary force. The rasp squeak of it frightened her. He glowered at her when she was slow to take it. You are holding up the line, he said. She reached into the tray gingerly, fearing he would yank it shut, crushing the bones of her hand and bursting her dirty flesh. He did not. Instead, he stared at her with open contempt and waved her through. The rusty turnstile pushed against her legs and clanked round. Another dirty, exhausted person took her place before the booth. After the Stink River, she had found there were protocols up Hive to accommodate errantry, with stations laid out as regularly as those for pilgrims heading to the major cathedra on the surface. She was surprised by that, thinking she'd have to fight every step of the way. There was not much food, there was not much water, but there was enough, and there were small shrines where she could sleep for a few hours a night. There were unpleasant people mixed in with those on genuine errands, not a few of whom were insane. Twice she'd had to push off grasping hands in the night. She'd seen a fight where a man was killed. She was tired. She was filthy. She had lost her shoes. Her clothes were torn, but she was almost there. The tabularum of Adept 1/8923-FG-4 was only a few miles ahead. Past the booth, the line continued, each scribum taking one shuffling step at a time. She wondered if any of their petitions would be accepted and the missives heard. She had faith that hers would be. In her mind, she had built a picture of 1/8923-FG-4 as a saintly man, an ascetic in fine robes, in a wonderful office decorated with lights and pretty sculptures. She could almost see him, smiling at her, saying all would be well, as kind as a priest. A real priest, not like Schreiber Leonard. He would know the Emperor had sent her, and because she had fulfilled her mission, she would be granted a portion of his grace. The line continued its sluggish progress. It wound up steps, and through open arches she saw the world become more beautiful, level by level. A smile spread over her face, so exhausted she experienced a state that was neither sleep nor wakefulness. What did it matter that the finery of these higher levels was tattier than she expected, that the carpets were threadbare and the lumens broken? To her, it was a manifestation of the Emperor's heavens, light and lovely. The line approached a large door. It took an hour to pass through, and came into a most wondrous place. She was on a gallery landing. A huge open space yawned to her right. On the far side were many other gallery landings, piled up like perfectly stacked documents. A sense of quiet concentration filled it. Important work was undertaken here. In her daze, she wandered out of line, towards the balustrade. She peered over the edge, down a dizzying drop, where thousands of officers shone little green ready lights and cast welcoming cones of yellow lumen glow out of their open doors. There were hundreds of people in line on the landings, for today was errantry day. She had no idea if that was a lot or not, but it seemed many. Servo skulls swooped and dipped between the levels, carrying scroll cases in metal pincers. She stared, dazedly. This was the holiest place she had ever been. A meaty hand grabbed her and pushed her back into line. Literati enforcers, armed with stout truncheons, policed the queues. These were of a different suborder to the ones in the lower hive, and wore ribbons crossed over their chests full of parchment scraps. The man shoved her, and she staggered into the wall. He was more devout than his fellows, and had forced the pins holding the parchment through his clothes and into his flesh, so that bright blood spotted the cloth. She stared at them, dumbly. Everything there seemed colourless in the face of the blood, its redness the sole vibrant hue in a world of grey and beige.
"In line! In line! In line!"
He screamed into her face.
"In line!"
She spent hours in a fugue. When she faltered, the hands of kinder petitioners steadied her. As she went further, the line moved faster, men and women leaving it as they reached the officers they sought. Yet hers was still ahead. She watched those others go with magnanimity, glad that they had reached their destination, knowing that hers would be better than theirs. Bells rang for worship. Those in the queue stopped and prayed. At midday, 2 pairs of literati passed down the line, the first doling out a ladle of water, the second a ladle of soup. Both Nora was obliged to receive in her hands, gulping the water down before they slopped in the soup. She had no other receptacle. The shift klaxon rang. Still the queue progressed. There comes a point where the human body will not tolerate exhaustion, and Nora was approaching it. Then, by a miracle, she noticed the numbers were counting up. 1/8899, 1/8900, 1/8910. A few men left the line at once, turning to their left like soldiers on parade, and vanished into doorways. The line surged forward. Ahead, groups of people were shoving their way into the same room. Her heart sank when she reached the door and found it was 1/8923-FG-4. The door was open, and there were many people inside, and that confused her. With rising apprehension, she went within. A scene of devastation greeted her. The office had been upturned. Furniture was smashed. The wall panels had been wrenched free, cables and insulating materials filthy with the dust of millennia spilling out. Papers were scattered everywhere. She turned sideways to avoid the line of empty-handed people coming out of the inner room. A literati enforcer was shouting at them to move on, move on. Dazed faces staggered past her. A well-dressed adept was arguing with the literati.
Intolerable situation. These messages are of the highest priority. Tell me, have you ever seen anything like this? Something is going on here. Someone must be informed.
He was red in the face and greatly agitated.
My orders are to ensure order, said the literati enforcer. You will have to take this matter up with my superiors.
The adept gestured to the desk. It had been tossed over and then set upright again. At the corners, the wood was bruised, showing soft yellow under the varnish. Another of the literati was bellowing at the people to drop their missives and get out.
Look at it, man. Can you not see the Emperor's hand in this?
The adept said. Then it was her turn. She stepped up. There were papers piled in no particular order, hanging off the desk, hundreds of them. As she watched, a small heap gave way and escaped across the room.
Paper on the desk, then leave,
the second enforcer shouted at her. Her ears rang. She held out her grubby missive and placed it, reverentially, with the others. She read the words again, the content of it as familiar to her as the lines on her hands, though still not completely understood. For the Lord Commander's eyes, Zone of the Dead, Nephilim anomaly, probable Xenos activity on an enormous scale. And its signatory, the exotic-sounding, but by now so familiar, Magos Perscruta Camelin Hyax 43-Tau-Omicron. Her gaze moved on to another. Nephilim anomaly, it also read. High Xenos activity levels, non-functioning of astro-telepathy. Advise immediate response. And another. Anomaly, Nephilim sector, immediate action required. At rate of growth, Manumantia will soon be engulfed. Ships of soulless, damned vessels. Nephilim anomaly, Nephilim anomaly, Nephilim anomaly. On and on it went, on every page, from dozens of sources. She glanced around at the tired, dirty people. They were all there for the same reason. How could this be? The literati enforcer grabbed her and manhandled her away.
No,
she said. Her voice was a croak, her lips raw. He shoved her hard towards the door. Another bell rang. The two literati nodded at one another.
That's it,
said the one arguing with the adept, ignoring his continued protestations.
Everybody out. This office is to be sealed at this hour by command of Adept Hortensio Flavius Ashku. Everybody out.
You will be hearing from me about this,
the adept said.
Save it for my lords, said the literati enforcer. I have ears only for the holy words of he on the throne.
Nora was propelled out of the door. Those still to gain entrance wailed in consternation. There was a maintenance team waiting outside with a plasma torch. Against the protests of the adept, they began sealing up the door as soon as everyone was out. The glare of the plasma torch drove the crowd back. Hot metal smell stung their nostrils.
This is ridiculous. the adept said. Gelfrain has been gone for months, and you are sealing it up now, while supplicants are coming, all with the same message? This is insanity.
This is terror, said the scribe militant, as if that excused it all. These things take time to process, you know that. The proper channels must be followed. He adopted a more emollient tone. I am doing my duty as is required, adept. Soon there will be another occupant here. The office is out for tender to the scribal lords. It's not often a hereditary position like this comes up. Competition will be fierce. If there is cause to investigate this upset, it will be done. The wheels of the great machine turn slowly, but finely. The Emperor knows all.
That will take too long, said the adept. Something is happening.
It is the Emperor's will.
No, the adept said. He pointed back at the door. He was shaking with anger. That is the Emperor's will. You are acting blindly. I will be back, he said, wagging his finger.
It was an ineffectual gesture. Powerless, he left. The crew welded the door closed with an efficiency uncharacteristic of Terran bureaucracy and marched off carrying their equipment. The crowd milled around. Then they too dispersed, taking the literati with them, who now their duty was done were absorbed into the mass. Nora was left alone in front of the cooling door. She dropped to the floor and began to cry. Chapter 40. Fleet Primus departs. I was there. Crusades beginning. There must have been a great celebration marking the departure of Fleet Primus from Terra. Fabian witnessed none of it, being confined to the librarium, where he laboured night and day. He was informed that the fleet was due to sail, and he was dimly aware of the ship's ratings rushing about to make it happen. His world was narrowed to the dot of ink on the nib of his pen, and he stopped returning to his quarters to sleep, snatching a couple of hours now and then under his desk, eating his meals there, until he became so focused that the menials serving him fresh food were taking full plates away with them. His mind fell back into the past, becoming a conduit for events centuries ago. He understood that in the life of the universe, 10,000 years was an eye blink, but for him it seemed unimaginably distant, and he underwent long periods of mental dislocation, trying to comprehend the gulfs of time. He only knew they had departed when Viablo tapped him on the shoulder with a long finger and huskily said, "That's it, we're underway." Fabian looked blearily up. Viablo's face swam in his vision like a balloon, tethered to some faraway meteorological station, dancing on alien winds. He was the fourth of the Historitors, recruited a few weeks ago. He was odd-looking, with a low-G native's bizarre physiology and strange habits, but Fabian liked him. He blinked. His eyes were dry as desert stone. He must have looked like he did not understand, and perhaps he did not, for Viablo repeated, more gently, "We have left Terra, Fabian. We are on our way to war." Viablo's words unlocked a door in Fabian's mind, and the present came rushing back at him, all the creaks and rumbles of a void ship, the barely perceptible hum of human life, and the machine activity that sustained it. Under all that, there was another note he had not noticed before, deep and thrumming. The ship had gained a voice and was singing to itself. "The engines," Viablo nodded. He was a solemn soul. Fabian had once seen a tree when he was very young. He imagined that if that tree had a human face, it would look like Viablo,